It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate, and we are doing a live Q&A with The Real News senior editor Paul Jay. Today, we're going to talk about the issue of Donald Trump and betrayal. In the aftermath of his Helsinki summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin, no single act has engendered as much bipartisan uproar as Trump's comments, casting doubt on the U.S. intelligence community and also blaming both sides, U.S. and Russia, for the poor state of U.S.-Russia relations. To give a sample of how bipartisan this is, we'll play a few clips. Uh, First, this is Steve Schmidt, former Republican strategist, speaking this week to MSNBC.
He is an agent de facto of Russia's foreign policy. The foreign policies he's advocating, the bipartisan consensus that existed pre-Trump between Republicans and Democrats, would have recognized this foreign policy as clearly in the middle lane of the Kremlin's strategic interests. And to see it being advanced by an American president is as disturbing as it is shocking.
So that's Steve Schmidt, a longtime Republican senior strategist on the McCain campaign in 2008. But it wasn't just Republicans who were angry at President Trump and accusing him of betrayal. It was also people like Senator Bernie Sanders.
That I was absolutely outraged by his behavior in Helsinki, where he really sold the American people out. And it makes me think that either Trump doesn't understand what Russia has done not only to our elections, but to cyber attacks against all parts of our infrastructure. Either he doesn't understand it, or perhaps he is being blackmailed by Russia because they may have compromising information about him.
So that's Senator Bernie Sanders. And there you have it. There's a bipartisan consensus that, in Senator Sanders' words, Trump has sold the American people out. But should Russia be the focus of this umbrage that both sides are taking part in? Well, to discuss, I'm joined now by Real News senior editor Paul Jay. He'll be taking your questions throughout this hour. So if you have them, put them in the chat below wherever you're watching, or send them to us on Twitter. Welcome, Paul. Your thoughts on this question that we've been hearing about in the aftermath of the Helsinki summit of Trump's betrayal of the American people. Do you think that Russia should be the area of focus for this question?
Well, it's hard to argue with anyone that says that Trump has betrayed the American people. And I'm sure he has and will do so many, many more times. But simply meeting with Putin is not a betrayal of the American people. Now, we don't know what was really said between Trump and Putin. I am not one that thinks there was some lovely conversations about arms reduction, nor do I think that one should hope for such things out of a meeting between Trump and Putin. I don't think either of them are peaceniks, but of course Trump represents the most aggressive power in human history, I guess you could say. So they're not certainly in the same league as being dangerous characters. Trump and the American oligarchy have committed great crimes against humanity. That being said, I do not trust any conversation between Trump and Putin, and not because either of them is the devil or demons, because both of them represent very reactionary states and represent states that are essentially controlled by oligarchies, whether it's the Russian or the American. So yeah, I'm always wary of when two leaders like that get together. But to be wary of these negotiations or discussions, one should not feed the most reactionary fears and stoke the paranoia that harkens up all the ghosts and demons of the Cold War. One should have a sober appraisal of when a big imperial power meets a mid-level power and look at what the consequences might be for the peoples of the United States, the people of Russia, peoples of the world. And there is a lot of reasons to think that Trump is betraying the American people, but not because he met with Putin. And I, while I have many points of agreement with Bernie Sanders, I think it's honestly, I don't know, I guess outrageous. Bernie Sanders should not jump on this bandwagon. And it doesn't, it says something one should be careful of about Bernie Sanders' vision of foreign policy. That he does jump on this bandwagon, because the real reasons to fear this meeting between Trump and Putin, and the real reasons for betrayal, well, first and foremost, that this is the meeting of two climate science deniers, the most serious existential threat of our time. And no one's talking about that. And that's a betrayal of the human species. And so we should be focused on that. We should be very concerned about that. There was a letter going around, a lot of progressive people signed, saying we shouldn't critique this meeting because it's a good thing when two nuclear powers meet. And of course, in principle, it is. But John Bolton just appointed to the National Security Council as an advisor, I think is the position, a guy named Tim Morrison. Tim Morrison was against the START nuclear, the treaty, Russian-American treaty. He's against New START. He was one of the key guys pressuring Obama and lobbying for Obama to put a big investment into nuclear weapons, which he did. Apparently, there's under Obama and then continued under Trump, $1 trillion over 10 years into developing new nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a betrayal of the American people, both by Obama and now by Trump. We should condemn that. And to think that Trump, who appoints a John Bolton, who appoints a Tim Morrison, and of course Bolton and Morrison are on the same page, who are against any kind of nuclear restrictions on the American military, and thus against any kind of arms treaty with anyone that might restrict Americans' might. To think that is going to be the conversation between Trump and Putin, we should call that out. We shouldn't be Pollyanna and create illusions that Trump is somehow going to be a peacenik with Putin. And we should try to think through what those discussions might really have been. And yes, condemn them, because we condemn the oligarchies of both countries. But we don't do it by jumping in the boat of this kind of American exceptionalism, American nationalism, rabid nationalism, where we are all of a sudden praising the CIA, and now we're cheering on the FBI like the organs of repression in the United States, who have systematically destroyed progressive political forces in this country for decades and spied on people. All of a sudden, we're rooting them on? I mean, what's going on in much of the liberal and much of the left in the United States is atrocious. And whatever the Russians did in terms of the 2016 elections is so insignificant compared to ramping up this vile, rabid, chauvinistic language. And I really sorry to see Bernie jumping and using the same kind of words. We need to talk about the whole truth here, and not create the grounds for the kind of militaristic policies that we know Trump's coming down the pike with, and I suspect is the real conversation between Trump and Putin, which is Iran. And what's happening with Iran, you have Netanyahu threatening Israeli military action. You have all kinds of back and forth rhetoric. The Iranians are now threatening they might block the Straits of Hormuz if the Americans start blocking Iranian oil exports. We know John Bolton and Trump, not just Bolton, that the objective is regime change in Iran. And Iran's going to be in a position with increasing economic pressure that they're going to need Russia and China in far more significant ways to buy Iranian oil and break the American sanctions. And that's, in all likelihood, what Trump is really talking to Putin about. And I wasn't in the meeting, and I guess other than a couple of translators, nobody was. But if I'm looking at this situation, Trump is saying to Putin, we don't want you to bail out the Iranian economy, and we don't want you to bail out the Iranian government the way you did Assad in Syria. You know, we're living with you saving Assad in Syria, but when we're coming after destabilization of Iran, we don't want you playing that role. And I have no idea what Putin responded with, but you know, Trump came out of those meetings smiling. So yeah, do I think Trump has betrayed the American people? Sure. But for none of the reasons that corporate media and the whole Democratic Party establishment mostly are talking about.
You know, one of those reasons, Paul, I see as this transition from Trump, and what was obviously a con to everyone who could look at it soberly, on the campaign trail of promising to be the champion of the working people, to then coming into Washington and, you know, overseeing a radical expansion of the upward transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. Just this week, there was a report that the Trump White House is considering a unilateral tax cut worth about $100 billion that would, of course, benefit mainly wealthy taxpayers. That was reported in the New York Times. You know, contrast all this, and this is after the tax cut that was already passed in Congress last year. Contrast all this with what Trump said on the campaign trail. I'm going to go to a clip of him campaigning in Pennsylvania.
Globalization has made the financial elite who donate to politicians very, very wealthy. I used to be one of them. Hate to say it, but I used to be one. But it's left millions of our workers with nothing but poverty and heartache. When subsidized foreign steel is dumped into our markets, threatening our factories, the politicians have proven, folks, they do nothing. For years, they watched on the sidelines as our jobs vanished and our communities were plunged into depression-level unemployment.
So that's Donald Trump on the campaign trail in 2016. Paul, wondering if you could talk about this game that Trump is playing now. I mean, he still paints himself as a champion of the working class. This week, he attacked the Koch brothers while still noting that he's made them very rich, and also leaving out the fact that he's not only hired many officials with ties to them, dozens actually, but also even, you know, adopted their policies that were written by Koch brothers funded policy groups. So the strange situation where we have, on the one hand, Trump continuing to attack people by name and painting himself as against them, while still behind the scenes pursuing their agenda pretty diligently and effectively.
Well, of course, that's the other great betrayal of the American people, the lies of the campaign and the reality of the Trump government. Rana Foroohar, and I can't remember the exact statistic, but she writes for the Financial Times. When I interviewed her, she had an interesting stat, which is Trump's cabinet alone has more wealth than, I think it is something like a third of the American population. We can go back and check. But of course, he's a total con man and hypocrite. The joke of what he just said about politicians who are bought, and the influence is bought by billionaires. He says, I used to be that. Well, he only means he used to be on the buying side, on the selling side, or maybe it's the other way around. He used to be on the buying side. Now he's selling the influence. I mean, he wouldn't be president if it wasn't for Robert Mercer and Sheldon Adelson, two of the most reactionary billionaires on the planet, who funded his presidency. And you know, I keep talking about the Robert Mercer story. It's still amazing to me how many informed people don't even know who Robert Mercer is, but used to own Breitbart and brought in Bannon and Kellyanne Conway. So he's a total con. Now the thing is about his economic message, and this is partly what's wrong with this focus on the Russiagate stuff. Again, whether everything's true or not true, I have no idea, and I've said many times I hardly don't care. because the messaging of Trump and the policies of the Trump administration are so destructive. But they do need to be unpacked in terms of their substance. Does this kind of immigration lower wages? When I say this kind of immigration, I mean people that are here without documentation, illegally. Does that lower wages? Does it take away American jobs? And that needs to be unpacked in a serious way, because it's not enough just to have sentiment that it's not fair the way undocumented people are being dealt with. It doesn't deal with the economic argument that Trump makes that is somewhat persuasive. Excuse me, not only Trump. But if one looks at just on the face of it, terrorizing the undocumented population, it doesn't make them run and leave the country. It makes them even more susceptible to work for even lower wages and to be even more fearful of fighting for rights. It's kind of just ABC logic. If one really has the objective of raising wages and defending jobs, then what you do is you help people legalize, and not only that, you help people unionize. But as long as this workforce is being terrorized, it's going to depress wages and make this competition worse for American workers that do have legal status and citizenship and so on. So we got to unpack the Trumpisms, and of course it's obviously not just Trump, because these are betrayals of the promises, but the promises do have some influence. A lot of people buy into this. Same way a lot of people buy into the argument that the reason jobs left America was because of unions, because wages were too high, which is nonsensical if you look at the data. But a lot of people believe this. As far as the Koch brothers go, I mean, Mike Pence is a Koch brother representative in the administration. It's clearly closely connected, Vice President Pence, to the Koch brothers. And there's always been this kind of competition between the Trump cabal and the Kochs. There was this one story once where I think one of the Koch brothers' friends were playing golf on a Trump golf course, and Trump actually kicked the person off the course, and David Koch was all angry. But this is secondary fighting that goes on, as you said, on the policy front, with a few exceptions. The Kochs apparently don't like the trade war going on. But I would think the Kochs would be extremely happy ratcheting up tensions with Iran, because this morning there's a report that if the confrontation gets sharp enough where the Americans actually block Iranian oil exports, and then the Iranians who have threatened their response will be to block the Straits of Hormuz, well, they're saying oil may go up to $250 a barrel. And I think the Koch brothers would be rather pleased with that.
So getting to Iran and Russia, I guess my sense of Putin is that he's an opportunist politically. He plays all sides, kind of like Qatar in the Middle East. They have ties pretty much at this point to everybody, except for Saudi Arabia, which is their bitter foe. And my sense is that no matter what, however Putin feels about Iran and Trump's designs for it, that he's sort of boxed in. On the one hand, he can't risk alienating the U.S. and Israel because they could hurt Russia even more. But at this point, also, Russia does have ties to Iran. It's investing billions of dollars in its economy, and Iran helps act as a sort of counterweight to U.S. Hegemony, which Putin feels threatened by. So I'm just wondering, how much do you think Trump could rope in Putin to whatever plans he has for Iran?
Well, one doesn't know what actually gets talked about, and there's not a lot of public statements that I'm aware of how the Russians view the regime change strategy of the United States, even though I know Mattis is claiming they don't have a regime change strategy, but Trump's clearly articulated it, and so has Bolton and many others that have come and gone from this administration, not least of all Steve Bannon, who I think still is in the ear of Trump. Well, if you look at it objectively in terms of who gains and who loses, I don't see how Putin loses. And when can I just say one thing before I say this, because I don't want to just keep saying Putin. Putin represents the Russian state. He represents a system. He's at the helm of the state. It's not all about Putin. You know, it's a whole convergence of a lot of interests, the same way it is here, and it's not much different. So that being said, I'll say Putin, but by Putin we mean this whole system of oligarchs and apparatchiks and the state and so on. If they do nothing, they win. What I mean by that is they don't have the power to block the United States ratcheting up economic sanctions on Iran. To some extent, maybe they can try to go around the sanctions. But I don't think the Russians are going to get into a big confrontation with Trump and the Iran agenda, because what happens? The more things ratchet up with Iran, the more the price of oil goes up. They're already talking now, just because of the coming sanctions in November, that oil probably is going to hit $80. And again, as I said earlier, real confrontation, you could start seeing $250, $300 barrel of oil, which is wonderful if you're an oil country, and Russia is an oil country, and so is the United States is an oil country, and the Koch brothers are practically a country. There's a lot of people that gain from this tension. And one should never underestimate, and you can watch all the interviews we've done with Larry Wilkerson on this and others, you cannot underestimate the banal economic motives behind so much of U.S. foreign policy. You know, guns and weapons and oil to mostly drive U.S. foreign policy. And so the weapons that are being sold into the Middle East, largely because the Saudi-Iranian tensions, and is beyond imagine the trillions of dollars of arms expenditures by the Middle Eastern countries, mostly buying American arms. the tension leading to higher price of oil. All of these things factor in to U.S. foreign policy and driving it. And even though while sections of the American economy will suffer with higher oil prices, it could spark a very serious recession in the United States. Still, arms and oil are going to cash in on that. And Wall Street finance, they can play all kinds of games around volatility. They love volatility. And the more things go up and down, the more money the insiders of Wall Street make. So Putin, if he just doesn't do much, wins. He'll do some rhetorical denunciation that the U.S. shouldn't threaten Iran this way, especially if they try some military action in Iran. Putin will condemn it. But oil prices go through the roof. And where does Iran go for help? Well, there's only two places Iran can go, Russia and China. And so, you know, Russia's one objectively doesn't have the power to stop the Americans from doing much in Iran. But I can imagine that when they met, you know, as I said, Trump could have said, you know, might have said to Putin, you know, don't try to save the Iranians the way you saved the Syrians. And I can see Trump saying, yeah, sure, because it's in his interest to let this thing unfold. It doesn't mean there is, you know, Iran isn't potentially a good economic partner for Russia, but you know, the levels of power. This is the thing about part of the deception of the American craziness about Russia. The disparity in power between Russia and the United States is ridiculous. Russia is barely a mid-level economy and mid-level power. Now, sure, they have a big nuclear arsenal. Sure, they have a big, you know, army, but not on the scale that they can assert Russian foreign policy in a direct confrontation with U.S. Syria came as close as possible to that. But even in Syria, there was a lot of American collaboration. They needed the Russians to come and stabilize and help get rid of ISIS and all this. So it wasn't such a direct confrontation in Syria as some people might have suggested. So yeah, so I think Putin lays back. Maybe says a lot of stuff, but essentially lays back.
You know, to underscore that point about the disparity between the U.S. and Russia militarily, this year, the increase in the Pentagon's military budget, just the increase alone, was more than the entire Russian military budget. Just the increase from last year to this year.
And if I understand it
which says-
correctly, the Russians actually reduced their military budget a little bit last year.
Yes, well, because I guess the thinking there is because now they can control our minds through social media. They don't need a strong military. But listen, Paul, you mentioned Larry Wilkerson, and I want to play a clip that I think speaks to the chauvinist attitude that this Russiagate fear-mongering has galvanized. He was speaking on the Bill Maher show, Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO, and he was attacked by Maher and the rest of the panel for essentially urging a sober look at this whole Russia thing and even encouraging basic talks between the U.S. and Russia. This is that clip.
I think this is appeasement.
Look at what happens
when he meets with Putin.
No, I think we need to have a meeting. We're getting very, very close to developing doctrine. The Russians already have. We're working on it. And the missiles, nuclear tip missiles, to accompany that doctrine. And we're getting back to a point where we could actually find ourselves contemplating nuclear war.
But why have a meeting with someone who attacked us in 2016?
But you need to talk to your enemies.
Talk to your
someone else talk to him?
But without preconditions? I mean, really, would we have had just a
I wouldn't say
friend?
any preconditions at all.
But
I'm not saying I'm in favor of this particular president talking
But wait
to
a
this
second.
particular ruler in Moscow. But we need to talk.
All our intelligence agencies said that Russia attacked us in 2016. Yes, it was cyber. It wasn't with armaments.
Well,
but it was
come on.
still.
Russia did no more than we have done to any number of countries since 1947.
That's true, but it doesn't make it right.
Doesn't make it. It's still us.
It's very true.
I'm sorry, but I'm on our team.
It doesn't make it something that should stop a meeting between two leaders who own more nuclear weapons than everybody else in the world combined.
Wow.
And who are getting closer and closer.
I can only
especially
imagine
in NATO.
what.
So that is Larry Wilkerson sparring with Bill Maher on Real Time with Bill Maher. And as many viewers will know, Colonel Wilkerson is a regular guest every week here on The Real News. And he just did a segment, an interview with us on his appearance on Bill Maher, which you can check out at therealnews.com. Paul J., listening to that, here you have a nominally liberal host like Bill Maher getting into it with Colonel Wilkerson, just for pointing out that talks are a good thing and that we do it elsewhere. And Maher's response is that, well, I'm on our side. I don't know, your thoughts on the chauvinism that Russiagate has brought out in liberals like Maher?
Well, that comment he says, yeah, I know what we do is wrong, but I'm on our team. So I don't know, what can you say? You scratch most Americans and you find chauvinism and this belief in America as number one and all this. You know, my kids went to kindergarten and, they got to put their hands, supposedly, put their hands on their heart and pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States. I mean, actually, I've given my kids the choice, and they don't want to. In fact, they're not standing and pledging. In fact, most of their class doesn't want to stand and do it either. But of course, as Americans are inculcated in this deep identification of Americanism, as if we are all one thing in America, as if there's no classes, as if the interests of the oligarchy are the same as the interests of the rest of the people here. And that this posture of the need for this militarization is somehow to defend America, not to assert global hegemony. I should even go another step, which is the argument often given is global hegemony itself is actually a defensive position, and homeland security and so on. The deep roots of this chauvinism, American exceptionalism, militarism in the Democratic Party should not be forgotten. The Democratic Party was the party of the Vietnam War. Truman, the Democratic Party, is the party that actually used weapons of mass destruction and dropped nuclear bombs on Japan. This deep feeling that in American liberalism, that this defense of America, and supposedly the land of rights and freedom and so on, requires a strong military, and that America is the fountainhead of enlightenment and defense of enlightenment. There's a liberal secular version of Steve Bannon and Trump's defense of Western Christianity. It's the same kind of faith-based. There's simply no objective evidence for any of that. I mean, clearly, under both Democrat and Republican administrations, dictator after dictator after dictator has been supported. The examples always given are the Saudis. We talk about that a lot. In Latin America, we talk about that a lot. But let's not forget, under both Democratic Party and Republican parties, there was support for the fascist Franco in Spain for years, support for the Greek fascists for years. This is not, the reality of America and the American footprint globally is not for democracy. It's for American dominance, and when possible, I would say when possible, the majority of the American elites would rather not have dictators. They want free movement of capital. What is that? Free movement for American capital to come in and dominate through the power of money, rather than through the power of a dictator and guns. Yes, but they don't mind dictators if the alternative is a country that wants some kind of independence or some kind of socialism. They'd far rather have right-wing dictators. This is in the liberal mentality as much as it's in the right-wing conservative mentality. They just both, one has this vision of defending Christian values, and the other one is defending it's okay to have a dictator over there because we're such liberals over here. Of course, it's not true here either. We're on our team, Bill Maher says. So we're on the team of gerrymandering. We're on the team of voter right suppression. We're on the team of suppressing the constitutional rights, as I keep saying, quoting the DOJ report on the Baltimore Police Department, where it said people's constitutional rights are being denied every single day in Baltimore, and of course not just Baltimore, in cities across the country, where African-American men can be shot down practically one every day, and almost no consequences to the police that are doing that. I mean, that's the team we're all on. So this crazy mythology that's spouting out of these liberals' mouths, it's dangerous, it's vile, and it's partly driven because they're so partisan. They just got to wound Trump. So, if somehow something wounds Trump, anything's justifiable if you're going to weaken the Trump presidency. And it's such a mistake, because even if it hurts Trump, it's creating such a fanaticism, or I should say feeding such a fanaticism, that the next Trump will make use of that. And whether that comes in the face of a Democratic Party or a Republican Party, this is the fanaticism that supports war.
Right, and the people, I think we could agree, best placed to fight back are the traditional left, people who've always stood up to racism and fascism and white supremacy. But the way I see Russiagate right now is being used in many ways to undermine the left. And to illustrate, I want to play a couple of clips. First, yesterday there was a hearing in the Senate on social media manipulation. And Republican Senator Richard Burr said that Russian influence efforts are ongoing and a grave threat.
The Russians conducted a structured influence campaign using U.S.-based social media platforms and others to target the American people using divisive issues such as race, immigration, and sexual orientation. That campaign is still active today. They didn't do it because they have political leanings to the right or to the left, but because they care about our elections, but rather because a weak America is good for Russia. Some feel that we as society are sitting in a burning room, calmly drinking a cup of coffee, telling ourselves this is fine. That's not fine, and that's not the case.
That's not fine. That's not the case, says Senator Richard Burr. And in the midst of all this new controversy over Facebook apparently finding fake accounts and even shutting down pages, we've seen the language like that Richard Burr just used, where he talked about divisive issues such as racism. We've seen that being used to delete groups and target groups that are fighting racism. So, for example, there's an upcoming counter protest to a Unite the Right rally, and Facebook deleted their event page because they accused them of being fake, when really actually this was a real protest. So what can this do but simply taint the people who are fighting back against the right, because you have people like Richard Burr trying to tie them to a Russian influence operation. And of course, the foes, meanwhile, who are escaping relatively unscathed or without as much scrutiny, are people like who you mentioned, Paul, Steve Bannon. And this is him speaking to a far-right gathering in France.
Let them call you racist.
Laissez-vous appeler raciste.
Let them call you xenophobes.
Mais laissez-les vous appeler xénophobes.
Let them call you nativist.
Laissez-vous les appeler nativistes.
Wear it as a badge of honor.
Portez-le comme un badge d'honneur.
Because every day we get stronger and they get weaker.
So that is Steve Bannon, the former chief strategist for President Trump, speaking to the far right in France. So, Paul, I imagine if you're Steve Bannon, you got to be loving this scene where you have both parties, Democrats and Republicans, basically painting leftist groups, anti-racist, anti-fascist, with the brush of being possible Kremlin dupes or Kremlin ops.
Where to start with all of this, Aaron? Let me back up to your first clip first, because I think it's kind of fundamental, and then let me try to pick up the next point. Why does Russia benefit if America is weak? Russia is about the oligarchs. The oligarchs are about money. The money that matters to the oligarchs, first of all, is mostly US dollars. They have properties they own all over the world. And first and foremost, the Russian oligarchs, like the American oligarchs and the Chinese and the Europeans and so on, they depend on the United States to manage global capitalism. If the United States were really to be so fractured by the Russian machinations and all that, and the American economy and politics was to go down the toilet because of all what Russia did, what the hell happens to the wealth of the Russian oligarchs? You know, global capitalism unravels if the American capitalism unravels, at least in this era. This may change in the future. Where do the Russians gain? Now, there is a sort of many dark sides to the Russian state and Putin, one of which is the alliance with some of the European far right, particularly Marie Le Pen in France. And Steve Bannon's there talking, I believe it was Marie Le Pen's organization he was speaking to. There's pretty clear evidence that Marie Le Pen's party borrowed money from a Russian bank, and it's, I think, even the former prime minister, I believe prime minister at one point under Putin, who's now gone over to the opposition, even he says this was a quid pro quo because Marie Le Pen came out and supported Russia's position on Crimea and supported the referendum. And there are some ideological convergences between this sort of, leader of this Russian Christian, mostly white state, and some of the ideology of the European far right. Apparently, there was a cooperation agreement between Putin's party and the Austrian far right party. They actually signed some kind of cooperation agreement. This does not in any way speak to how Russia gains with a broken up or screwed up EU. How does Russia gain for that? I mean, Russia, one of their primary markets for Russian energy is Europe. If Europe becomes into a mess and the EU falls apart, and it weakens the economies of Europe, how does that benefit Russia for one of its major customers to be in disarray? I mean, the Russians are not trying to march into Europe. They never were going to march into Europe, Western Europe. There was all a crock, and the CIA analysts kept telling Reagan that the Soviet Union's military posture was essentially defensive, not offensive. And there's lots of data that proves that. But certainly in today's world, Russia's going to try to take over Western Europe. It's ridiculous. Russia wants the destruction of Western Europe and the EU. For what? Yes, they would like the EU not to be on the sanctions page with the United States. And yes, it's in Putin's interest, the Russian state's interest, to encourage some political forces, like on the right, who support Russia's position on Crimea and don't want the sanctions, support Russia's position on lifting the sanctions on Russia. But this image that Senator raises of that Russia's out to destroy the United States, it's insane. It's completely insane. And go back to the previous thing we were talking about, and so much of the liberal establishment is talking the same, somewhat similar language. It just makes no bloody sense. Now, can you make your point again about the left? Because I'm not sure I got it.
So we had Senator Burr talking about how Russia is exploiting "quote unquote" divisive issues like racism and sexism, as if alleged, real or imagined Russian intervention could have any impact on the very real issues of racism and sexism here in the U.S. And now the fact that you have Facebook deleting the Facebook pages of groups who are real groups who are organizing against, for example, this Unite the Right rally that's coming up on the grounds that Facebook accuses them of being a fake group, similar to the ones that they've alleged are tied to Russia. Just how this stink of Russia can be used to undermine real progressive groups who are fighting the issues that senators like Richard Burr are saying that Russia is exploiting to divide the country.
Well, I mean, I guess it's a little bit goes back to the discussion of what Bernie Sanders was saying and some of the others. If you try to focus on the real issues of race, which let me say about Sanders, he does focus on real issues, which is why it's disappointing that he jumped on this thing, because he's actually one of the few major politicians that has a mainstream stage who does focus on a lot of the issues of substance of the Trump administration and does focus on the real issues of the electoral system, gerrymandering and Citizens United and the unlimited corporate and billionaire money involved in the political system. I mean, Sanders speaks much more about that than he does about the Russia stuff. But there's a mood, to some extent, I don't know, it's affected Sanders and others. It's a McCarthyite mood that if you don't get in on this, denouncing the Russians' interference here, you're disloyal. Back to this betrayal conversation. This is now, if you don't, how many liberals had to come out and denounce the Communist Party of the United States and name names, people that were, progressive in many ways, but they had so much, I'm talking Jerry McCarthyism and the House of Un-American Activities Committee. People had fairly progressive views, but the pressure was just so enormous that if you didn't come out against the communist conspiracy, you were a traitor. And there's that same kind of pressure coming on. And yeah, I guess it can come to people that are, denouncing racism and such. Someone on the right wing, certainly that won't come from the left or Sanders, but from the right might be saying, oh, when you start denouncing racism in the United States, you're playing into the hands of the Russians that want to show divisions in the United States. Yeah, there could be some of that. But the bottom line here is we need to tell the whole truth. And the whole truth does not prettify the Russian state, and it certainly doesn't prettify the American state. But we don't succumb to this feeling that Americans are all in the same boat. Like Obama used to have this line, you know, no red states, no blue states, just the United States. That's a crock. This society has got very, very serious class divisions. Again, to his merit, Bernie Sanders often talks about the American oligarchy, and he talks about the what is it, 5 individual men have more wealth than 50% of the American population, something like that. These are the real serious divisions within the country. And just like McCarthyism, this current Russiagate mania is a complete distraction from the very serious, critical problems, crisis, existential even, starting with climate change, the renewal of this kind of geopolitical rivalry that we saw lead to 2 world wars in the 20th century, the expansion of America's nuclear arsenal, and underlying all this, a completely parasitical and enormously powerful finance sector, which is just sucking the wealth out of the whole global economy, gambling in a crazy casino against multimillionaires and billionaires betting against each other, sucking wealth that should be put into more productive uses so the economies grow in a real way. And I've mentioned before, and I'll never stop saying, the plan for the future, which is of the elites, which is an existential threat of climate change, and the rich essentially heading for the hills. They've got their escape routes ready, and they imagine a world where artificial intelligence does most of what working people do. And these people protect themselves from the climate crisis. And even if you don't buy into that, which to me seems to me it's only common sense, and there's plenty of evidence it's happening, but there's no question that one of the great threats that are coming in the next 10, 15 years, it's already starting, is massive unemployment. As robots, artificial intelligence start driving trucks and driving taxis and delivery cars and flying airplanes. They're even talking about AI being able to do most of what doctors do. I mean, there's barely a profession that AI isn't going to wind up taking over in the next 10, 20 years. So massive unemployment coming, which is barely being talked about in all this craziness about the Russiagate stuff. We're at a turning point, or I should say a crossroads, for the whole of humanity. And, we're talking about some troll farms.
All right. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap, but I want to ask you one question, Paul, from a viewer, which I think speaks to what you're talking about. Marco writes, what do you think of the aphorism, U.S. corporate media is the Berlin Wall of our time?
Not sure I quite get the analogy.
I think he's asking insofar as the Berlin Wall, cut off Germany from being united and kept, two narratives apart. It's sort of the obstacle to peace and reconciliation.
Well, it's certainly the obstacle to having any kind of realistic view of the world. And we've said lots of times on the Real News how corporate media almost completely ignores the climate science and the climate crisis. Most of the corporate media is either cashing in on this Russiagate stuff because it's driving ratings. I mean, there's no serious conversation about anything. It is the most cynical, nihilistic, and destructive fervor on the CNNs and the MSNBCs, and from the other side, from Fox. There is simply no care of what's happening to the future of our societies, to the future of our people. And you can barely hear a serious, reasoned voice on television anymore. Barely a one. And I mean, it's why we're doing the real news, but we're so small compared to that. Anyway, it's the thing about the Berlin Wall is it just took some hammers to knock it down eventually. The Russian economy imploded, Eastern Europe fell apart, and the Berlin Wall comes down. The problem with the corporate media in the United States is that it's a real extension of the American state. That's the critical part. You know, the merging of the corporate and state interests, Mussolini style, which is what's happening in the United States. It's not new, but it's speeding up. It applies very much to corporate media. The corporate media is, you know, they can attack this individual Trump, but the loyalty to the American state and the American system is deep and profound. And yeah, we got to break down that wall.
A good place to wrap. Paul Jay is the Real News senior editor. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News.